Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Autism has increased dramatically in recent decades. Most parents assume this is an irreversible condition. Can it ever be overcome? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Most people think of autism as a lifelong developmental disorder. Many kids with this condition have trouble relating or communicating with others. But research shows that as many as 10 to 20% of children on the autistic spectrum can change their outcome with early intensive intervention. What kinds of approaches work best?
We talk with a leading researcher, a parent of a child who's no longer autistic, and a therapist who explains applied behavior analysis.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, learn about the possibility of overcoming autism.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, dried plums, also known as prunes, are famous as a remedy for constipation. Now researchers working with rats have found that a diet rich in dried plums may reduce the risk of colon cancer. The rats in the study were randomized to get a diet including prunes, or one with equal calories, fat, and protein, but no dried plums. At the end of the study, the rats who had been consuming the dried fruit had a different balance of gut bacteria, with more of the phylum Firmicutes and fewer of the phylum Bacteroidetes. The ecology of the gut bacteria are thought to play an important role in whether a person develops colon cancer, with Firmicutes being more protective. Apparently, the phenolic compounds in the dried plums have antioxidant activity and help encourage the shifting balance of gut flora. In addition, the rats eating the prunes had fewer precancerous changes called crypts in their colon tissue. While we still don't know if eating dried plums will help protect humans from colon cancer, it should at least make bathroom visits easier.
Can you keep your bones strong by taking calcium supplements? Older people, particularly older women, have long been advised to get 1,200 milligrams of calcium daily, primarily from supplements. But research from New Zealand, published in the BMJ, indicates that calcium supplements don't do much to prevent fractures. 2 studies were published. One was a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. It found that men and women who took calcium supplements increased their bone mineral density by about 1% a year, instead of having it decrease about 1% a year, as it does for postmenopausal women. The other study looked at research on dietary calcium and fractures. It found just one study of a somewhat unusual group of frail elderly individuals had found benefit from increased dietary calcium. Since previous studies have shown disadvantages to calcium supplements, including an increased risk of heart attacks, it may be time to rethink their value.
Most people know that sugar-sweetened beverages are bad for the waistline. A new review of research suggests they're also bad for the heart. 2 Harvard nutrition scientists report that the increased sugar in high-fructose corn syrup in the U.S. diet has contributed to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. They base their conclusion on both observational studies and controlled trials, and they point out that the way fructose is metabolized contributes to the problem. In addition to its effect on caloric intake, fructose stimulates the liver to make extra fat that gets packed around the abdominal organs.
Is there a way to prevent diabetes? 15 years ago, a study called the Diabetes Prevention Program showed that diet and exercise work as well as taking a drug called metformin to keep at-risk people from developing out-and-out diabetes. In the original study, conducted between 1996 and 2001, volunteers who were overweight with elevated blood sugar were randomly assigned to take metformin, to take a placebo, or to follow a low-fat diet and do 15 minutes of moderate-intensity exercise every day. Those in the lifestyle group were 58% less likely to have developed diabetes than those in the placebo group. Metformin also worked, though it was less effective. When the researchers followed up with the participants after about 15 years, 62% of those in the placebo group had developed diabetes. That compares to 56% of those who took metformin and 55% of those watching their diet and exercising.
People who have diabetes should not skip breakfast. That's the conclusion from a study that compared blood sugar and insulin levels after lunch and dinner on days that people were instructed to eat breakfast compared to the days that they were instructed to skip it. There were 22 volunteers with type 2 diabetes in this crossover study. On the days when they were randomly assigned to eat breakfast, their blood sugar, free fatty acids, and other markers after lunch and after dinner were lower. The researchers conclude that skipping breakfast increases the likelihood that blood sugar will spike after later meals and impairs insulin response. This is a problem for people with type 2 diabetes. This suggests that a good breakfast is especially important for people with diabetes. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. According to the CDC, autism affects 1 child out of 68 in the United States. This is a dramatic increase over the last several decades.
The news that a child has autism can strike fear into a parent's heart. Autism can be overwhelming, but it isn't necessarily an irreversible condition that never changes. To help us understand how some kids can beat autism, we turn to Dr. Deborah Fine. She's the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor and head of the Clinical Division in the Department of Psychology at the University of Connecticut. She's also a professor in the Department of Pediatrics in the School of Medicine there.
Dr. Fine, I wonder if you could tell us about autism and specifically what is autism spectrum disorder?
Well, autism spectrum disorder is a group of closely related disorders that are characterized by 2 main behaviors. The first is problems with social communication, which includes things like making relationships with other people, especially peers. Sometimes relationships with adults are much better. And it also includes deficits in communication, nonverbal and verbal, such as problems making eye contact with other people, problems in basic communication like pointing with the index finger to what you want. If the child is older or more verbal, they would have trouble having conversations, noticing other people's emotions. And then the second group of symptoms is restricted and repetitive behaviors. And those include things like resistance to change in the environment, liking things to be the same all the time, preoccupations with interests that are sometimes a little strange for other people to understand, like astronomy tables and National Geographic collections and collecting electric quartz heaters and things of that nature. There are also repetitive speech, like reciting monologues and dialogues from movies, repetitive movements such as rocking and hand flapping, and then sensory sensitivities like being either underreactive or overreactive to various sounds and feelings and sometimes sights in the environment.
Dr. Fine, this use of the word spectrum, can you help us better understand what that means? Because it's not an all or none phenomenon.
No, that's quite right. It's not. The spectrum refers to the extreme variability that one sees in children, adolescents, and adults with autism. So in terms of functioning level, you can have individuals with autism who essentially have no language, not much understanding of language, and they don't speak, and they may not even communicate in other ways, all the way up to individuals who have, they're very, very high functioning, they have excellent vocational and educational skills, they have very high language ability, they can carry on a conversation, although it may be a bit one-sided. There also is extreme variability in the severity of symptoms. So you can have somebody that's just kind of mildly, socially, not picking up on subtle cues, all the way to individuals who really have very little interest in other people as people. So there is a huge spectrum in just about every symptom and skill that you would want to measure.
Dr. Fine, how early can autism be diagnosed? And is it something that kind of sticks with you for the rest of your life?
Autism can be diagnosed in some children as early as the first half of the second year of life, so 12 to 18 months. That's not the average age of diagnosis, which in this country is closer to 3.5 or 4 years old. And in some countries, and even in some groups within this country, it's closer to 5 to 6 years of age. But in general, it can be diagnosed reliably before 18 months of age, and it's pretty stable after that. The outcome is very variable, and some individuals remain really severely handicapped in their activities of daily living and their communication for the rest of their lives. Many individuals with autism get better, and they develop more functional abilities, but they still have very easily diagnosable autism for the rest of their lives. And then there's a smaller group, which is the group that we've been studying for the last 5 or 6 years, who really lose the diagnosis and lose all the symptoms of autism.
When you say lose, you mean in essence they quote-unquote grow out of it or overcome it or are no longer diagnosed on the autism spectrum scale?
So they are no longer diagnosed on the autism spectrum. I wouldn't say they grow out of it because to the best of what our data is showing, almost all of them got early intensive treatment. So I would never want to say, wait and see what happens, he may grow out of it. We would want to start early intervention as early as possible and have it be really high-quality intensive intervention.
So if you're talking about early intervention and you're talking about getting a child started in intervention before they're 2 years old, how would a parent suspect that there might be something wrong and that they would need intervention?
There are screeners for autism. There are some recently published screeners that may be useful at 12 months. I'm a little dubious about whether we can do population screening at 12 months, but certainly if a parent has any concerns about the child's ability to communicate by looking at the parents, by smiling at the parents, by paying attention to language when the parent speaks to them. You don't expect a 12 to 15-month-old to be understanding a lot of language, but you do expect them to be interested in looking at the parent when the parent talks to them, making eye contact, smiling, being interested in showing the parent what they're doing, getting the parent's approval for what they're doing, showing the parent something interesting that they see. So if a parent is suspecting that a child, let's say 12 to 18 months, is not doing those things as other children are doing them, they should definitely talk to the child's pediatrician and express their concerns and ask the child to be screened for possible autism-related disorder.
Now, this runs in the face of what a lot of parents have been either told or taught or have learned on their own, and that is once their child has been diagnosed with autism, that it is potentially irreversible. And we got very interested in this topic as a result of the New York Times Magazine article, "The Kids Who Beat Autism." And I think it comes as a surprise to a lot of parents to learn that some children actually can overcome this condition and become really quite highly functional, if not quote-unquote normal adults. So could you tell us a little bit more about that and perhaps some of your own stories and experiences with such children?
Sure, and let me first respond to the idea perhaps of reversible. So for most children, they are not going to lose the diagnosis, but the symptoms and the skills are not irreversible. So even children who are going to have autism the rest of their lives and significant challenges in communicating and functioning the rest of their lives, they are still capable of growth and development. So no parent should think that their child, particularly a young child, but even an older child or an adolescent, cannot make progress, because virtually every child can make progress with good therapy. But then there is this fascinating set of children who really overcome virtually all the symptoms of autism and become indistinguishable from kids who never had autism. So I started to see this in my clinical practice, and the first thing that I was seeing was a number of children who lost the symptoms. In fact, I just saw one last week, another one who looked just like what I'm about to describe. He's losing the symptoms of autism. This child I wouldn't say is off the spectrum yet, but he's moving rapidly in that direction. But he has very significant attention problems. So that was the first set of kids that we published a paper on about 8 years ago, of kids who lose the deficits in social communication and they lose the restricted and repetitive behaviors, but they're left with significant attention problems so that they would meet a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And they would need help with their attention, which could be behavioral programming. In some cases, it would be medication. But that's still a much less challenging diagnosis and really more easily treatable than autism spectrum disorder. And then some of these kids went on to really even lose the ADHD. Some of them still have some attention problems. That's one of the things we found in this study of what we call optimal outcome individuals, that some of them still would meet criteria for ADHD, but many of them have even gotten over that problem.
Dr. Fine, in the New York Times Magazine article, The Kids Who Beat Autism, there were a couple of case stories in which one child did extremely well and, has fully integrated back into society. And another child who got pretty much the same treatment but did not make anywhere near that kind of progress. Do we have any idea why one child does so well and another child just doesn't seem to?
That's an excellent question, and the short answer is no, we have absolutely no idea. The story that you're referring to it's just a fascinating, wonderful story about two moms who became good friends when their children were diagnosed very young. And they went through the same journey looking for the most effective treatment, and they found a good treatment, and one of them, did absolutely wonderfully. Language developed really rapidly, and he is now in his 20s and shows no signs of autism, whereas the other young man is still significantly impaired in many aspects of his life. There has to be some biological difference between these two kinds of children, because I've seen probably hundreds, maybe thousands by now, of children who got excellent, intense, very early intervention, and they certainly all make progress. They learn to communicate in some way or other, but many of them, most of them, don't make the kind of progress that the young man with the optimal outcome made.
You're listening to Dr. Deborah Fine, the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor at the University of Connecticut. She's also head of the Clinical Division in the Department of Psychological Sciences and professor in the Department of Pediatrics in the School of Medicine.
After the break, we'll talk more about achieving optimal outcomes with early intervention.
What types of treatment make a difference?
Dr. Fine will offer her advice for parents, and we'll also talk with a parent about her experience.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Redex Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show, number 1008. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Our topic today is autism. There are sporadic reports of youngsters who seem to be able to outgrow or overcome this diagnosis.
To learn how that might be possible, we're talking with Dr. Deborah Fine, the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor at the University of Connecticut. She's also head of the Clinical Division in the Department of Psychological Sciences and professor in the Department of Pediatrics in the School of Medicine.
Dr. Fine, you've been describing how some children who get really good intervention early are able to make such progress that they have an optimal outcome. I'm wondering if you could tell us very briefly what sorts of treatment really help.
So we collected retrospective data. This was all by parents' recollection as well as their whatever early records they had on the children. And we asked them to identify in 6-month intervals whether a child had applied behavior analysis, or ABA, whether they had a more developmental therapy, such as floor time, whether they had speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, any kind of medical treatments. And then we also asked them, to the best of their recollection and their records, how many hours a week of total treatments, and then of each of these treatments the children had. And there was really only one really significant finding, which was the percent of our autism stable group versus our optimal outcome group who got ABA, or applied behavior analysis. And also another interesting thing was that the biggest difference was between 2 to 2.5 and 2.5 to 3. In the 2.5 to 3 age group, 56% of the optimal outcome children got ABA, and only 7% of the high-functioning autism children got ABA. Now, this has to be qualified by saying that not every single child who recovered got ABA, and not every individual who got good, intense early ABA had this optimal outcome. In fact, most did not. So when I see children clinically, really no matter what age they are, ABA is usually the therapy that I recommend in almost every case. But, as I said, most of the kids who get good ABA and have, fantastic parents who are getting them the absolute best they can and carrying it over into everyday life and, seeing physicians and giving them the best healthy diet they can, and just, bending over backwards to do everything they can for these children. Most of those children do not reach this optimal outcome. It still is really a minority of the kids. We don't know what percent are capable of this kind of outcome, but the best guess would be somewhere between 10 and 20%.
Dr. Fine, in the New York Times article that Joe has been referring to, one of the children who was featured is a young man named Mark McCluskey. And apparently some of the response to this was for physicians to say, oh, well, if he no longer has a diagnosis of autism or no longer fits the diagnosis of autism, then he must have been misdiagnosed to start with. What's the response?
We do hear that pretty often, and I think what underlies that is this belief that once you have autism, you must have it for the rest of your life. And therefore, if you don't have it now, you never could have it, and it must have been a misdiagnosis. But autism is a behavioral diagnosis. There is no medical, biomedical, biological marker for autism. So it is based purely on behavior. And if a child had all the behaviors indicative of autism when they were 2, 3, or 4, then they had autism by definition. And we went to great lengths to make sure that the early diagnoses were accurate by getting very detailed early records and showing them to our master clinician, blind to the group that the child was in now, and mixed in with foils that were children that had a global developmental delay or a language delay. We also compared early records and parent recollections of specific behaviors between our optimal outcome group and our high-functioning autism group, and they were really not different. The only way in which they were different was that the optimal outcome kids were a little less socially aloof, but their communication and their repetitive behaviors were equivalent to the other children. Also, we did one prospective study, that is, one study where we saw and diagnosed the kids at age 2, and then we followed them to age 4, as opposed to the studies that the New York Times wrote about, which were retrospective, where we got kids once they had moved off the spectrum and then got retrospective records. In this prospective study, we diagnosed the kids when they were age 2, and they were indistinguishable from other kids that we diagnosed with autism. And then we saw them at age 4, and about 20% of them, after getting good intensive therapy, had already moved off the spectrum. So we had their early records. In fact, we'd made the diagnosis, and we had all the description of their behavior. So we know that they had all the symptoms of autism. And since autism is diagnosed based on behavior, it doesn't really make sense to say they didn't have autism.
Dr. Fine, what's the take-home message for parents who may be listening?
I think there are a few different take-home messages for parents of kids at different ages. So for parents of very young children, where they either suspect that there is some kind of developmental delay in social-emotional communication skills, or the child has been diagnosed already, but they're still quite young, then my take-home message is to try to get intensive behaviorally oriented intervention as soon as you can, because the earlier the better. For parents of older kids who are either in middle childhood or adolescence, the message is that kids can still make progress no matter how severely handicapped they are, and they should still be looking for behavioral intervention, but not to think, oh, if I had gotten my kid diagnosed at age 2 instead of age 5 or 6 or 4 or 8, that they would have moved off the autism spectrum. Because, as I mentioned, it's still a very small percent of kids who are capable of making this progress. There are some kids who make this kind of progress even without ABA, and ABA is just not available in all parts of the country. So, try to start where you are now and think about how you can help the child make the most progress. But don't think if the child had been diagnosed early that they would have been able to achieve optimal outcome, because that is not the case for 80 to 90% of kids.
You've been listening to Dr. Deborah Fine, the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor at the University of Connecticut. She's also head of the Clinical Division in the Department of Psychological Sciences and professor in the Department of Pediatrics in the School of Medicine.
We turn now to a parent to hear her story.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Karen Siff Excorn.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Karen, I wonder if you could give us an overview of what happened with regard to your son, his diagnosis, and how this story unfolded.
Sure. So Jake was one of these kids who developed, quote unquote, normally. He hit all the developmental milestones. He walked, he talked, he played. And then between the ages of 17 months and 2 years, it was like he was on this dimmer switch. And at first we noticed that he stopped responding to his name, and we thought maybe he was having a hearing problem. And then he stopped accepting our hugs, and he started doing things like turning on and off light switches and opening and closing doors. He was no longer interested in playing with toys. But what he would do is he would lie face down, and he would take a toy truck, and he would run it back and forth in front of his eyes on like an imaginary 3-inch track. So now you have to know that during that time, I went to my pediatrician, and I said, "Doctor, I think there's something wrong with my son." And he said, "Karen, you're a first-time mother. You're being too competitive, you're overreacting." And I would tell him that I would take Jake to the playground, and I would see other kids his age running around and playing and talking and laughing, while my kid would be lying face down in the sandbox. So the doctor said, Karen, boys develop later than girls. Just wait. So I waited, and I watched as our son lost speech and language, lost the ability to interact with the world.
So this is over the course of about half a year, a little bit longer, if we're talking from 17 months to 2.
That's right. And by his second birthday, that's when it hit me. Because by his second birthday, he stopped speaking entirely. And at that point, he was grunting. I mean, he was making noises to indicate what he wanted. It was scary. So at that point, I decided that I was no longer going to listen to my pediatrician, that I would take Jake. Now, this is interesting. I said, all right, my son must have a hearing problem. So I took him to an audiologist, and she ran all these tests, and he didn't respond at all. And I thought, great, he's hard of hearing. I mean, at least that would have been an answer to what was going on with him. And she indicated that there was nothing wrong with his hearing, that his hearing was just fine. So at that point, I took Jake to a developmental pediatrician. And she ran a battery of tests over 2 days. And then we met, and she told me that Jake had autism. And I got to tell you, I was shocked at getting that diagnosis. And you would have thought at that point that I would have felt this sense of relief. Yay, we finally know what's wrong with our son. But instead, it was really emotionally overwhelming.
And that's understandable because what you probably read on the internet, what you probably heard from people is that, when someone is affected as severely as Jake was, there may not be a good solution. There may not be a cure.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, and at that point, too, you have to know that we're talking 16 years ago. So autism is a household word today, but it wasn't then. And so you're right. I went on the internet, but most of what I knew from autism was Rain Man. So, yeah, there was no one talked about cure, no one talked about hope. People talked about institutions or, it was pretty dire at that point.
Right. And that movie doesn't show a very promising outcome.
No. Mm-mm.
So what did you do then, Karen?
Well, the first thing I did was I brought Jake for a second opinion because I really wanted to believe that he didn't have autism. And I was given the same diagnosis again, that he did. And so then I just sprung into action. It was kind of like I took off my mom cap and I put on my advocacy cap, and I went into business mode. I had been running a management consulting business for years, and so I basically used the skills I had learned in running my business to help my son. So what I did was I did a ton of research and found out the best treatments for autism and chose those treatments, and then went to work hiring a team of therapists. It was like running another company, and that's what I did.
Well, tell us how you found Debbie Fine and what the result was.
Well, before I tell you that, let me just go back for a minute to just tell you about what kinds of treatments that we used. The treatment that I found that had the most science behind it and the best results was something called ABA. And ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. It's based on Skinner's principles of operant conditioning. But here's the way it works. It's basically you reward the behavior that you want repeated. Okay? Now, the ABA people will probably hate me for using this way to describe it, but if you can imagine the way you train your pet, your dog. So if you say to your dog, if you're teaching your dog to sit down, you'd say, sit down, and then you push your dog's butt down and you give your dog a treat. And then you do it again and again until finally you don't have to push your dog down and you don't have to give your dog a treat. All you have to do is say, sit down, and your dog sits down. ABA is based on those same principles. So, in fact, we had to teach our son how to respond to simple things like the command sit down. So we would do that, and we would practice it over and over again. And we would give him an M&M, and we would practice this over and over again until his brain successfully rewired to the point where he knew the word sit down meant I lower my body into a chair. Now, we did this for over 40 hours per week, one-on-one therapy. We had a team of therapists. Our front door was like a revolving door. We had a team of therapists coming in, doing 2-hour sessions with Jake. I mean, this was intense. And in addition to that, we had speech therapy and occupational therapy. And what happened was it was slow, but ultimately Jake's brain started rewiring, and he started making connections, and sounds became words, and words became sentences, and sentences all of a sudden. Now, granted, at the beginning, everything he was learning was rote learning. But then one day, it was like this miraculous day, he exhibited what is called spontaneous language, which meant that he just said something on his own, something that wasn't repeated, that wasn't by rote. He just spoke on his own.
You're listening to Karen Siff Excorn. She's a mother, and she's also author of the Autism Sourcebook, everything you need to know about diagnosis, treatment, coping, and healing from a mother whose child recovered.
We need to take a short break. Coming up, Karen Excorn will tell us how she felt when her son used language spontaneously.
And we'll learn a lot more about his progress from that point on.
We'll find out how Jake is doing now. And we'll talk with Dr. Rebecca McDonald about ABA therapy.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening to this podcast of The People's Pharmacy. If you like it, why not rate or review it in the iTunes store? We'd appreciate it. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Foot Cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
And by Squatty Potty, the original toilet stool that creates healthy toilet posture. Learn how squatting relaxes the colon and allows for easy, healthy elimination at squattypotty.com.
To order a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1008. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today our topic is autism. We're exploring whether and how some children on the autism spectrum are able to overcome this disorder.
We were just talking with Karen Excorn about the exciting moment her son Jake used spontaneous language.
And Karen, how old was he at this point?
He was 4. So
Okay.
we had been Yeah, he was around 4. We had been doing this intensive therapy for 2 years.
That must have been a magical moment.
It was a magical moment. It caught me by surprise. I took him out for ice cream, and I was cheating on his diet. We had tried the gluten-free, casein-free diet for a while. And it was one of those mom moments where I wanted to take my kid out and have like a typical mom-kid afternoon. And I took him out for ice cream, and I was holding him on my hip, and we were looking through the glass case at the different flavors, and the man behind the counter said, "What do you want?" And I went to say to Jake, "Now, there's this flavor," and all of a sudden this little voice said, "Nilla." And it was like, oh my, like what just happened? I mean, it was unbelievable that he heard what the man asked him and he answered on his own. And
what did he say?
He said Nilla, meaning like vanilla. He wanted vanilla ice cream. So he wanted vanilla ice cream. And this was, you have to know that everything that we did had to be explained, and then we would have to repeat and over. So that's what's called spontaneous language, when you can answer on your own. And after that, things seemed to accelerate. He started picking up things from his environment, the way that typical toddlers learn. So he was getting social cues from other kids when they were doing circle time, because at that point we had put him into a preschool with typical kids, and he had an aide with him. But he was just blossoming. It was like circuit breakers were clicking on inside of his brain. So what we did was we brought him back to the doctor. Shortly after his 4th birthday, we brought him back to the developmental pediatrician for more testing. And we were hoping that maybe he was more mild on the spectrum. I mean, we didn't know what to expect. But a girlfriend of mine who had a kid who was the same age as Jake said, Jake looks just like all of the other 4-year-olds that she sees. And I said, no. Sure enough, we go to the developmental pediatrician. She runs these battery of tests. She gives me the results, and she says, "I need to tell you what these mean." So I said, okay. And she said, "The autism community doesn't like using this word, but your son is cured of his autism." So I said, what? I mean, seriously, no one used that word then. They still don't, or they hardly use it now. And I said, I don't understand. And she said, he not only no longer meets the criteria for autism, but he doesn't display any residual autistic behaviors or idiosyncratic behaviors. Your son has fully recovered from autism.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a big wow is right. I got to tell you, I felt as shocked hearing that news than I did when I heard the news that he had autism. I mean, it was such a big wow. And so the first thing I said to her was, well, can it come back? I mean, because here was a kid who it seemed like he developed typically, then had autism, and now you're telling me he doesn't have it anymore. How do I know? And she said, his brain has successfully rewired. So what we did was we kept up his therapy. We kept up some speech therapy and social skills therapy for about a year or so after, and then that was it. He was done with his treatment. It was wild. It was wild. Again, because we didn't go into this thinking that, we hope one day our son will fully recover. We embarked on this journey hoping and praying that our son would speak again one day. So this was truly, you want to talk about living beyond your dreams? This was that.
Now you say Jake is now 18.
He's 18.
Headed to college?
He is. Well, he was accepted early admission to Michigan, which was his first choice.
Congratulations to all of you.
Our alma mater, so we're very excited for you. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, my goodness. Go Blue.
Yeah, you bet.
Go Blue. Yeah, he is so excited. He's really excited. I mean, this is a kid, he's very athletic. He's played high school football. He's done wrestling, track, everything else. So he wanted to go to a school that had great sports.
Karen, what would you like our listeners to take away from your story and Jake's?
So one of the reasons why we share Jake's story is to offer hope, but not false hope. Because one of the things that we recognize is that most children on the autism spectrum do not recover. And only a very small percentage of kids recover. And then even a smaller percentage experience what's called full recovery, where, again, you no longer meet the criteria for autism and don't display any kind of residual autism behaviors or symptoms. But one of the things that it's so important to know that treatment, early intervention is so crucial to helping a child on the spectrum, no matter where they are on the spectrum. And study after study shows that with intensive early intervention, a child can show progress. And that progress can mean giving a hug or saying a word or making sentences or making friends or all the way up to recovery. So, if I were listening to the show and I were a parent of a newly diagnosed kid or a friend of a parent of a newly diagnosed kid, the first thing that I would say would be to get your child treatment as soon as possible.
Karen Siff-Excorn, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Karen Siff-Excorn. She's a mother and also author of the Autism Sourcebook, everything you need to know about diagnosis, treatment, coping, and healing from a mother whose child recovered.
We turn now to Dr. Rebecca McDonald. She's the Senior Program Director of the New England Center for Children and is a clinical psychologist and a board-certified behavior analyst.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. McDonald.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Dr. McDonald, we're told that it's important for parents to recognize if their child might be on the autism spectrum and get diagnosed as soon as possible. Why is that so important?
The reason that is so important is that the earlier children start intervention, the better their prognosis is.
Tell us a little bit about the intervention. That is your specialty, isn't it?
Yes. I work at the New England Center for Children, which is a school for children with autism, and we provide services based on ABA. And ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. So behavior analysis is a natural science approach to understanding behavior, and ABA is a use of behavior analytic methods to change socially important behaviors. ABA has been endorsed by both the U.S. Surgeon General as well as the National Institute of Mental Health as the most effective treatment for individuals with autism.
Can you explain what it is, how it works, how a parent might interface with a team or a clinical psychologist who is trained in ABA?
What a parent wants to do is find somebody who is licensed as a board-certified behavior analyst. So somebody who's well-trained in applied behavior analysis. They can find that person by going on the web and looking at the BACB website or by asking the medical professionals in the hospitals near where they are. And then once they identify somebody who can provide this intervention, then there are a number of different procedures that are implemented by this interventionist.
Tell us a little bit more about what sorts of procedures we might encounter.
All right. So the first thing that is done is the child's evaluated. So we determine what skills a child has and what skills the child hasn't. One thing about applied behavior analysis, it's a very practical intervention. We're looking at behaviors that are really important for skills for children to learn to be independent and successful in their lives. So we're looking at communication skills and social skills and self-help skills. So we identify what skills a child has and what skills they don't have and prioritize the skills that we need to teach. Secondly, once we've identified what we need to teach, we need to develop a program for actually teaching that skill. And one of the ways that behavior analysts teach skills is a procedure called discrete trial instruction, where we provide multiple opportunities of the same skill for the child to practice. For example, a teacher might say to a child, or a parent might say, stand up, and the child then is given an opportunity to stand up, and that behavior is followed by praise or the presentation of something that the child likes that we would call a reinforcer. And that increases likelihood next time somebody says stand up, they will stand up. And that's how we teach children to follow instructions. But that's not the only way. That's very prescribed. And for children with autism, we need to extend instruction to provide more naturalistic teaching so that the child not only learns a skill, but learns to use it in their everyday lives. So more naturalistic teaching involves creating situations that are child-initiated, meaning the child wants something and they initiate to you that they would like this toy or whatever it is. So a teacher or a parent might provide a toy to a child, but it's out of their reach, and wait for the child to use the word to request the toy before they actually give them the toy. In that case, the child is inherently motivated to learn. Learning's more fun, and there's a positive social interaction that occurs as a function of that.
Now, of course, our listeners and, quite honestly, health professionals often learn best through case histories, case stories, anecdotes, if you like. And I'm wondering if you could share some stories from patients that you've interacted with and what kind of progress they were actually able to make.
I can describe a little girl who came into our program. She was not verbal at all, had a lot of tantruming to get out of things, crying, that kind of thing. And over the year, this is a little girl who came in at 1. Over the year that we followed her, that we worked with her, she learned language. She was able to request things. She learned how to play with toys. She engaged in joint attention. So if you had her enter a room and there was something on the ceiling or something unusual in the room, she would point to it, initiate to it, and then she'd look back at the other adult in the room like, did you see that? Look at that. So gaining... she was now part of the social world. She was interacting with other people. She was initiating interactions. She was happy, smiling. You know, she really, she just came a huge way in a year, and her parents are so grateful. And she's now in 3rd grade and doing really well. And her parents they're just thrilled.
Dr. McDonald, how do parents participate in this ABA approach? I'm assuming that their active engagement is really important.
It's very important. One of the ways that they can engage with or participate in this programming is to watch us and to learn from the therapists that are working with them. Play is a really important skill for many young children with autism, and typically developing children just develop play on their own. I've worked with many families who have just many, many toys in their house, and the child with autism doesn't play with any of their toys. So we spend a lot of our time teaching the parent how to teach their child to play with the toys that are in their own home. And that means that the children learn how to play with the toys, they learn how to interact socially with their parents, and they also now have the skills to interact with peers and their siblings with these toys that are in their home.
So, Dr. McDonald, what is the message for parents who get a diagnosis of autism or suspect at an early age with their children that there is something wrong? Is it possible for children to recover from autism spectrum disorders?
I'm not going to use the word recover, but I'll use Deborah Fine's word, best outcome. There are many children who can have very good outcomes if they're diagnosed early, if they get treatment early, if their parents are involved in treatment, and they're really engaged with people in their environment.
Dr. Becky McDonald, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to Dr. Rebecca McDonald, Senior Program Director of the New England Center for Children. The website is www.necc.org. There's a link to it from our website.
We heard earlier from Karen Siff Excorn. She's a mother and also author of the Autism Sourcebook, Everything You Need to Know About Diagnosis, Treatment, Coping, and Healing, from a mother whose child recovered. We also spoke with Dr. Deborah Fine, the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor at the University of Connecticut. She's also head of the Clinical Division in the Department of Psychological Sciences and professor in the Department of Pediatrics in the School of Medicine.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered it. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Red-X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
To order a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1008. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can find it on the web at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you go to peoplespharmacy.com, you will find a link to the New York Times Magazine article titled The Kids Who Beat Autism. It describes Dr. Fine's research in greater detail. You'll also find information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. You can share your own experience and your thoughts on today's show.
At our website, you can also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You'll never miss another People's Pharmacy program again. You can also share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks very much for listening, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to the People's Pharmacy.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. BetterHelp recently surveyed over 16,000 people and found that while 75% of people believe it's wise to seek support, only 27% of Americans are in therapy, and people stay silent to avoid being judged. BetterHelp has over 10 years of experience matching you with the right therapist. Because we're all better with help. Visit BetterHelp.com/StopTheStigma for their first ever State of Stigma report, the latest in mental health research.